Long ago, in a small Irish village, a village long since lost to the shadows and history both, there lived an old, tiresome drunk. He was not the kind of man you would welcome with open arms. In fact, many of the village folk had long since given him a wide berth. Indeed, they tolerated him at the markets, where, in his drunken splendour, he would help himself to whatever he pleased, and they endured his distasteful antics in the local pub, where he drank and drank and drank. No one knows exactly who this thieving drunk was, and the village folk at the time had no real desire to find out. For the most part, he would keep to himself, but when he drank, and he often did, his deft fingers would go to work. He could steal rings from ladies' fingers without them even noticing, and he could pinch the pennies from a man's wallet in the time it took him to blink. Of course, no one had any real proof of this man being a thief. He was far too good at it. But the village soon began to suspect him of his trickster ways, and before long, he was shunned by the community. As the years went by, the thieving drunk grew more and more resentful of his exile, if you will. He began to drink more to drown his lonely sorrows, which in turn, of course, led him to steal more and more. He would take from the plate as it was passed around in church, and he would pinch the wristwatches of anyone he passed by, as if it were low-hanging fruit. Rumour had it that he even entered the graveyard at midnight and would rob the caskets of the deceased. All this would see the drunkard become more and more shunned by his fellow man. Sure, the pubs would allow him to drink. He was probably their best customer. But even they had been victim to his schemes, from his dodgy coins to his fraudulent deeds. Stingy, they would call him when he refused to pay for his drinks. Stingy Jack. The village folk would glower at him whenever he entered the pub, and they would snigger from their tables. Ha! It's that poor sod Jack. He's got some nerve showing his face around here. Or, look, it's that old drunk who urinates on the street. He's the most disgraceful man I've ever known. Mothers would warn their children, don't go near that man, he's dangerous, he is. Or, mind yourself around him, he's got the devil in him. Even the most robust of men, the woodcutters, the smiths, and even the guards, would keep their distance and mutter amongst themselves, that Stingy Jack sure gives me the creeps. But there was someone who wasn't afraid of Stingy Jack. In fact, he was quite intrigued by the fellow. Having heard the tales of this disgusting, desperate, despicable man, the devil himself manifested in the local pub to see this diabolical Jack with his own eyes. And the devil looked at him with his old tattered hat, his ripped, dirty clothes, and the profound stench of the gutter, and the devil nearly recoiled in his seat. Why, the legends were true. This really was the most vile and immoral man he'd ever laid eyes on. Why, sin quite literally oozed off of his body, leaked down the legs of the chair, and filled the crevices in the rotten floor. Yes, this was a man that Satan liked the look of. Stingy Jack, the devil breathed him in. What a fine addition you will make to my gallery at home. But if Jack was at all perturbed by the devil, he did not show it. In fact, with a somber look in his eyes, he gave Satan an ironic wink and downed the rest of his drink. Indeed, Jack did not so much care for the appearance of the devil. He had seen a lot worse in his long and miserable life. He had wallowed in the darkest pits, slept amongst the shadows, dwelled in the most grim of clefts and crannies. The devil was just another face in a long line of bitter memories. But still, it was the devil, and his appearance now could only mean one thing. Satan had come for his soul. So Jack made one last request to the devil before being ripped from the mortal plane and damned to eternal suffering. It was a simple request really, and that was to clear his tab at the bar. Satan had always seen men try and do good in their final moments, particularly when he had come for their souls. They would often beg, promise to be better, or in Jack's case, would actively go out of their way to do something nice for once. Sometimes Satan would acquiesce, if only to amuse himself at their pitiful efforts. And so he agreed to Jack's terms, only to remember that he didn't carry money himself. "I'm the devil," he looked at Jack. "What use would I have of money?" And just like that, Jack worked his silver tongue the way he always had. He told the devil that if he transformed himself into a silver coin, then he could pay the bartender off. Then, when the bartender wasn't looking, Satan could change back and proceed to take him to hell as intended. Now normally, Satan wouldn't have tolerated such foolishness, but he did enjoy seeing someone tricked, duped, or otherwise completely ripped off. Why, he was so impressed by Jack's nefarious tactics that he agreed to go along with the plan. So Satan transformed into a coin and shivered with excitement at having taken advantage of the bartender. But Jack had a different idea in mind. He did not approach the bar to pay off his tab, but instead placed the coin containing Satan into his pocket, which also happened to contain a crucifix. Sealed by the magical properties of the crucifix, Satan was bound to the coin and could only be released upon Jack's word. Bah! The devil was quick to realize that he'd been deceived by Jack, and suddenly, the thought of being trapped inside this coin, inside this vile man's pocket, began to dawn on him. He tried to climb out from the coin, tried thrashing against its surface, tried screaming in hopes of shattering his own prison. But the form was true, and just like that, Satan was trapped. Jack admired the coin as he sat there in the pub, twirling it between his fingers and flipping it up and down. With each bump the coin took, he heard Satan growl with anger and pain both. With no real need for such a coin, Jack decided to make a deal with the devil. He coerced Satan to spare his soul for another 10 years, and in exchange, he would set him free. Begrudgingly, Satan agreed to the terms, and with that, Jack was spared that night. But the devil made him a promise that in 10 years he would return to take his soul, and on that night, there would be no bargaining or trickery. There would be no last rites, no final words, no hesitation on behalf of the devil, as he vowed to see Jack again in no more than 10 years to the date. But Jack had already lost himself in another drink he'd pinched from the next table over, and before the night had even ended, Jack had forgotten about Satan completely. But Satan had never quite gotten over what Jack had done to him, and he counted down the days when he was next allowed to approach the hoodwinking con artist that was Stingy Jack. On one misty night, when Jack was leaving the local pub, Satan manifested before him once more, and stood before him on a cobbled path. Ha! Satan licked his lips. At last, for 10 years I have waited for you, and now your time has come. Jack, who was, as you might imagine, drunk out of his mind, began to sway in the middle of the road, and had to use a tree to settle his balance. Had it really been 10 years? Jack was sure the devil must have made a mistake on his calendar, but he was in no state to argue, although argue had become his default mode. He staggered towards Satan and lowered his head, seemingly accepting his grim fate. But when Satan reached out to take him by the throat, Jack caught the glistening of a ripe red apple dangling from a branch above. Satan, who had hoped to instill more fear into Jack now that he was finally upon him, couldn't help but notice the drunken man pondering on this apple. "Why are you looking at that apple instead of beholding me, mortal?" Satan inquired, doing his best not to lose his cool. He'd done nothing but curse Jack in the 10 years since he'd seen him, and longed for the day he could relish in his revenge. He wanted Jack to suffer, but he also wanted him to cry and beg and plead for his salvation. He wanted to hear the desperation in Jack's voice, to see the tears flow from his eyes, to smell the delicious horror as Jack realized his time was up. But there was none of that. It was just Jack staring gormlessly at an apple. When Satan took another step towards Jack, Jack stopped him and declared that he was starving, and that if he could have just one more meal, he would gladly go to hell and answer for everything he had done. All of the devil's instincts told him to ignore Jack and his desire for nourishment, and to instead grab him by his scrawny neck and drag him down to the depths of hell. But granting desires was always something that Satan had prided himself on, especially when those desires included fruit. It reminded him immediately of the old ways, back when he had tempted that delicious-looking woman, that first woman, into taking a bite out of the apple of all apples. In some ways, it reminded him of a much simpler time. "That apple," Satan pointed, "I will fetch it for you as your last meal on earth, and then you will spend eternity with me." Jack nodded with all sincerity as he rubbed his stomach, so Satan began to ascend up the tree, a more than troubling task when one had hooves for feet. But determined, Satan hoisted himself up along the bark and heaved his weight onto the bough of the tree. There the apple sat ahead of him, glistening in the moonlight, perfect in every way. But then something else caught his eye down below, the glistening of several little trinkets. They were so bright they began to burn his eyes, and as the intensity of that light increased, it began to burn his face, his flesh, his tail, everything suddenly uncomfortably warm. Jack had placed a dozen crucifixes on the ground and surrounded the trunk of the tree with them, like headstones in a cemetery. "No!" Satan roared as he watched Jack bid him farewell and begin to walk away. "No, you have not done this to me again!" But it was true. Jack had outsmarted the devil for a second time, and the fate of Hell's overseer rested once more in Jack's nimble hands. "What is it you want?" Satan beckoned him back. "Tell me, mortal, and I will grant it for you in exchange for my release." Jack was half tempted to ask Satan for a case of booze and maybe a decent roast to go with it. But no, he'd earned his freedom once, and this time he intended to keep it. So he demanded of Satan that regardless of all the horrible things he had done, and regardless of all the horrible things he would continue to do, Satan would never take his soul to hell. With not much choice, Satan grit his teeth and agreed. Then he was set free. In the years that followed, Jack's lifestyle would see to his mortal end. First, his rotten liver finally failed him, and then his heart gave out, ironically, just as he left the local pub for the last time. He lay there in the cobbled streets with just enough strength to roll himself over onto his back, and there he stared up into the darkness of the night sky, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything remotely close to heaven. He had no delusions that angels would swoop down and fetch him, but trusting his wily ways, he believed he could somehow scam his way through the pearly gates. After all, he had outsmarted the devil twice. Could God have been any different? With his final breath, he felt his soul lifting out from his body, and as he rose to the heavens, he caught the faintest glimpse of St. Peter and the bored grimace he wore on his face. "Oh, Stingy Jack," the saint said to him with the slow shake of his head. "Oh, yes, to hell with you, I believe." Stingy Jack opened his mouth to retort, but before the words could fill the silence, St. Peter had replied, "Save it. I have no need for your lies. You are not welcome here. Do give Satan and all his little friends my regards." But Jack remembered his deal with Satan, and he told St. Peter that he had to get into heaven, for the devil had already agreed not to take his soul. "Now that sounds like a you problem, does it not?" St. Peter had already buried his head in his parchment. "Be gone now." And just like that, Stingy Jack felt himself sinking through the atmosphere as he descended away from the glorious presence of the saint and planted firmly on the coal-speckled ground. Flames enveloped him on either side, and a tall gate that was made from iron and bones stretched out before him. A large silhouette emerged from the gates, and the closer it got, the more space it took up. Like a spilled glass of whiskey, it soaked up the surface and left a dark smear that gradually grew and grew. First Jack saw its mouth, then came its nose, then its undeniable eyes, crimson red eyes that flared with vengeance. His horns were much bigger here. Everything was bigger here. He hadn't looked this fearsome in the pub, and he hadn't looked this mad on the road home. But Satan was back, and this time Jack was on his turf. "You," Satan snarled, his form only growing larger and larger. "Why have you come here? Did you die? Leave this place immediately." For the first time in a long time, Jack stammered and couldn't find the right thing to say. He explained that St. Peter had turned him away from the pearly gates of heaven, and that he had no other place to turn to. Come to think of it, he had no real control of his body, now that he was a floating, ethereal presence. A ghost, perhaps? He wasn't sure of anything anymore. He'd heard stories of purgatory, an endless void of greyness that traps souls forever and ever, neither living or dead, just something in between. But this was somehow worse. This was some kind of prison. "Feels bad, doesn't it?" Satan snorted. "Rejected from heaven and turned away from hell. Nobody wants you, Stingy Jack. You'll have no home from here on out." And Jack began to plead with the devil as he tried to find some logic in this strange and horrible place. Why was this happening to him? What would he do now? And perhaps more pressingly, where would he go? "Why are you still here?" Satan barked at him. "Go back the way you came and hurry. You're making the lobby look untidy." The way back to the village was stormy and dark, and Jack hesitated at the sight of such a journey. Why, he could barely make out the pathway, it was so gloomy and downcast. So he turned to Satan one last time and begged him to provide a light to help him find his way. "A light?" Satan sneered before rummaging in his pocket. "Fine, if it will get you out of my sight. Now, this gift isn't as nice as the one you gave to me. But I hope that it will do." Satan produced a flame between his fingers and flicked it at Jack. But as Jack reached out to catch it, he burned his hands, much to the amusement of Satan. The only thing Jack could find to house the satanic flame was a turnip, which sat in his breast pocket. One, of course, he had stolen a few days prior. After some difficulty, he was able to hollow out the vegetable and place the flame inside it, where it burned for eternity. From that day forward, the man once known as Stingy Jack was doomed to roam the earth forever and ever, never once knowing of rest and never once knowing of peace. It is said that to this day, old Stingy Jack still lurks amongst the remnants of that old shadowy village, with only the light from his turnip to light his way through the darkness.